August 15, 1945. In Times Square, New York City, 2 million people erupted in celebration. Sailors kissed nurses, strangers embraced. Confetti rained from office buildings. The photograph of a sailor kissing a woman in a white dress would become one of history's most iconic images. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. 60 miles away, in the reading room of Columbia University's library, Professor John Dower sat surrounded by newspapers from across America. He was studying something that troubled him deeply: the language used to describe America's enemies. The headlines celebrating Japan's surrender used terms like "Japs defeated" and "Oriental menace ended." But when he compared these to newspapers from May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the language was strikingly different. German surrender was described as "Nazi regime falls" or "Hitler's government collapses." The distinction was subtle but profound. Japan, the entire nation, the entire people, was the enemy. Germany's government was the enemy, not necessarily the German people themselves. Dower would spend the next 40 years researching this linguistic and cultural divide, eventually publishing War Without Mercy, a groundbreaking study of racial attitudes during the Pacific War. What he discovered explained one of history's most puzzling questions. Why did Germany, despite killing far more people and inflicting greater horrors, become the focused symbol of World War II evil in Western memory, while Japan's equally horrific actions faded into relative obscurity? The answer isn't simple. It involves Cold War politics, geographic distance, racial perception, the nature of the crimes themselves, how each nation confronted its past, and the stories victors chose to tell themselves. Understanding why requires examining not just what happened during the war, but what happened in the 70 years after. This is that story, an examination of memory, narrative, and how the world decides which villains to remember and which to forget.
Let's establish the facts clearly. Both Germany and Japan committed atrocities of staggering scale during World War II. Neither nation holds moral superiority. Both engaged in systematic mass murder, torture, human experimentation, and deliberate campaigns to exterminate entire populations. Germany's crimes are well documented. The Holocaust killed approximately 6 million Jews through systematic industrial murder in death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The Nazi regime also murdered millions of others: Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, Roma people, disabled individuals, homosexuals, political dissidents, and Slavic civilians. Total civilian deaths attributable to Nazi Germany exceed 17 million people, not counting military casualties or deaths from war-related famine and disease. The death camps represented industrialized killing on an unprecedented scale. Gas chambers designed to murder thousands per day. Crematoria running continuously to dispose of bodies. Detailed records tracking the extermination process. The systematic plunder of victims' belongings. Gold fillings extracted from corpses. Hair shaved from the dead, used to stuff mattresses. The Nazi genocide was organized, documented, and executed with bureaucratic efficiency. Japan's crimes were equally horrific, though less known in Western consciousness. The Nanjing massacre in December 1937 killed between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over 6 weeks. Japanese soldiers engaged in mass rape, killing contests, beheading competitions, and systematic torture. Photographs exist showing Japanese officers smiling beside decapitated heads, treating mass murder as entertainment. Unit 731, Japan's biological warfare research program in Manchuria conducted human experiments that rivaled Mengel's atrocities. Prisoners, called logs by their captors, were infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and other diseases. They were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, frozen alive to study frostbite, placed in pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their skulls, and dissected while conscious to observe organ function. Over 10,000 people died in these experiments, and perhaps 200,000 more died from biological warfare attacks using plague-infected fleas dropped on Chinese cities. The Burma Railway, immortalized in the bridge on the River Kwai, killed over 100,000 Asian laborers and 16,000 Allied POWs through forced labor, starvation, disease, and brutal treatment. The Bataan Death March killed 10,000 Filipino and American prisoners. Japanese forces massacred civilians across Asia. Manila in 1945 saw 100,000 Filipino civilians killed in a month of deliberate atrocities. Japan's military sexual slavery system, euphemistically called comfort women, forced between 200,000 and 400,000 women from Korea, China, Philippines, Indonesia, and other occupied territories into sexual servitude for Japanese troops. Many were teenagers. Most never returned home. Survivors faced lifelong trauma and social stigma. Total estimates suggest Japanese aggression killed between 10 and 20 million civilians across Asia, predominantly Chinese. This doesn't include military casualties or deaths from war-related famine and disease. The numbers are comparable. The horror is equivalent. Yet global memory treated them differently.
The divergence in memory began before the war even ended, driven by realpolitik that prioritized future alliances over past crimes. As Soviet forces advanced westward in 1944-1945, American and British planners recognized that post-war Europe would be divided between communist and non-communist spheres. Germany, or at least West Germany, needed to become an ally against Soviet expansion. This required a delicate recalibration of how Germans were perceived. The solution was to separate Nazis from Germans. The narrative became the Nazi Party had corrupted Germany, led by Hitler and his inner circle of fanatics. But ordinary Germans were victims of this regime, misled by propaganda, coerced into compliance, and deserving of rehabilitation into the democratic Western alliance. This distinction served practical purposes. West Germany needed a functional government, which required employing people who had worked under the Nazi regime. Konrad Adenauer, West Germany's first chancellor, had opposed Hitler, but thousands of officials in his government had been Nazi Party members. The narrative of good Germans versus bad Nazis made this politically palatable. Japan faced similar calculations. As communist forces gained control of China and North Korea emerged as a Soviet satellite, Japan became strategically critical. General Douglas MacArthur, governing occupied Japan, concluded that maintaining Emperor Hirohito was essential for stability. This decision required avoiding prosecuting Hirohito for war crimes, despite his role in approving military actions. But the distinction applied differently in Japan. There was no equivalent to separating militarists from Japanese people in Western discourse. Japan's crimes were often attributed to Japanese culture or Asian cruelty rather than specific leaders or ideologies. The racism that had characterized the Pacific War, viewing Japanese as fundamentally different and alien, persisted into the peace. The Tokyo War crimes trials prosecuted Japanese leaders, but they lacked the comprehensive nature of Nuremberg. Many officials responsible for atrocities, particularly those involved in biological warfare, received immunity in exchange for sharing research data with American forces. Unit 731's commander, Shiro Ishii, never faced trial. His subordinates were turned to prominent positions in Japanese medicine, business, and academia. This practical amnesia served Cold War interests, but created lasting impacts on historical memory.
Geography profoundly shaped how Western nations remembered the war. For Americans and Europeans, Germany's crimes occurred on familiar territory: Poland, France, the Netherlands, countries they knew, could locate on maps, and in many cases had family connections to through immigration. European Jews who died in the Holocaust included relatives of American Jews, who formed influential communities in major cities and used their platforms to ensure Holocaust memory remained prominent. Organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and countless local Holocaust education centers kept German crimes in public consciousness. Japan's crimes occurred in places most Westerners couldn't locate on a map: Nanjing, Harbin, Manila, Burma. The victims were Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Indonesian, people whose suffering registered less strongly in Western consciousness, if it registered at all. Asian American communities existed, but were smaller, less politically influential, and themselves often marginalized. The linguistic and cultural barriers reinforced this distance. Holocaust survivors who settled in the West could communicate their experiences in English, German, Polish, or Yiddish to audiences who shared cultural reference points. Chinese survivors of Japanese atrocities communicated in languages few Westerners understood, describing experiences in cultural contexts that seemed foreign and difficult to relate to. This geographic reality created different narrative accessibility. Anne Frank's diary, written in Amsterdam, became required reading in Western schools. Iris Chang's The Rape of Nanking, published in 1997, struggled to find a mainstream audience despite documenting equally horrific events. The familiarity of European geography made German crimes feel closer, more real, more relevant to Western audiences.
The specific nature of Nazi crimes contributed to their prominence in Western memory. The Holocaust was unique not in its cruelty — cruelty is sadly universal — but in its industrial systematization and ideological coherence. Nazi Germany constructed an entire bureaucratic apparatus devoted solely to genocide. They built specialized killing facilities, developed efficient murder technologies, maintained detailed records, and created an administrative system that tracked victims from identification through confiscation of property to final disposal of remains. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 brought together Nazi officials to coordinate the final solution: 15 men in suits discussing logistics of continental-scale murder as if planning a business operation. This bureaucratic horror proved compelling to Western audiences. It violated expectations of how civilized, advanced societies should behave. Germany wasn't a backward nation. It was highly educated, technologically sophisticated, and culturally rich. That such a society could systematically murder millions made the Holocaust uniquely disturbing to Western sensibilities. The death camps themselves became powerful symbols. Auschwitz-Birkenau, preserved as a memorial, provides physical evidence of industrialized murder. Visitors can walk through gas chambers disguised as showers, see crematorium remains, view warehouses filled with victims' belongings, shoes, suitcases, hair. The physical infrastructure of genocide creates a visceral impact that transcends language and culture. Japan's atrocities, equally horrific, lacked this systematic architectural legacy. Unit 731's facilities were destroyed by retreating Japanese forces. The sites of massacres in China were rebuilt. There's no equivalent to Auschwitz that visitors can tour, no preserved infrastructure that makes the horror tangible. Additionally, Nazi ideology was explicitly articulated.
Hitler's Mein Kampf laid out anti-Semitic ideology clearly. Nazi propaganda films, speeches, and documents provided explicit evidence of genocidal intent. Nuremberg prosecutors could present paper trails showing orders, approvals, and administrative processes. Japanese atrocities often occurred through decentralized military violence rather than centralized bureaucratic systems. Orders were frequently verbal rather than written. The ideology, viewing Chinese and other Asians as subhuman, was implicit in military culture rather than explicitly codified in accessible documents. This made Japanese crimes harder to prosecute and harder to explain in simple narratives.
Western memory of World War II centers on liberation stories, Allied forces freeing concentration camp prisoners, deposing a totalitarian regime, restoring democracy. These narratives feature Western protagonists as heroes, which makes them appealing to Western audiences. American and British forces liberated camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The photographs and films of these liberations, emaciated survivors greeting Allied soldiers, bulldozers pushing piles of corpses into mass graves, became iconic images of the war. Eisenhower ordered extensive documentation, insisting that Germans from nearby towns tour the camps so they couldn't claim ignorance. This documentation ensured Holocaust memory would be preserved. The liberation narrative fits comfortably into Western self-conception. Democracies defeated fascism, freed the oppressed, and restored civilization. This story has heroes, Allied soldiers, villains, Nazis, and victims, Holocaust survivors, and occupied Europeans. It's morally clear, dramatically satisfying, and centers Western agency. Japan's defeat followed a different pattern. Rather than liberation of occupied territories, the Pacific War ended with atomic bombings and Japan's surrender. There was no triumphant march into Tokyo equivalent to the liberation of Paris or entry into Berlin. The war ended abruptly through overwhelming force rather than systematic liberation of occupied territories. Additionally, the liberation narrative in Asia is complicated by colonialism. American forces liberated the Philippines, but the Philippines had been an American colony before Japanese occupation. British forces liberated Burma and Malaya, but these were British colonies. Dutch forces returned to Indonesia, French to Indochina, both resuming colonial control rather than granting independence. The Asian victims of Japanese aggression, predominantly Chinese, Korean, and Southeast Asian, liberated themselves or were liberated by forces that don't fit comfortable Western narratives. Chinese communist forces fought Japanese occupation, but celebrating them as liberators conflicted with Cold War politics. The Soviet Union liberated Manchuria, but this too was problematic for Western narratives during the Cold War. The result was that Western memory focused on stories where Western nations played heroic roles, liberating European camps, rather than stories where Western nations' roles were more ambiguous.
How each nation confronted its past profoundly affected global memory. Germany's reckoning with the Holocaust, though slow and incomplete, far exceeded Japan's acknowledgement of wartime atrocities. West Germany began seriously confronting the Holocaust in the 1960s. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, 1963 to 1965, prosecuted camp guards and administrators, forcing public discussion of German responsibility. The 1968 student movement demanded that the older generation acknowledge their complicity. By the 1970s and 1980s, Holocaust education became mandatory in German schools. Willy Brandt's 1970 genuflection at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial symbolized official acknowledgement of German guilt. Successive German governments issued apologies, paid reparations to survivors and Israel, and constructed memorials. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, opened in 2005, occupies prime real estate near the Brandenburg Gate, a physical manifestation of Germany's willingness to confront its past. This confrontation wasn't complete or universal. Many Germans resisted acknowledging responsibility. But the overall trajectory was toward greater acknowledgement, education, and memorialization. German law prohibits Holocaust denial. Schools teach the Nazi period extensively. Public discourse treats the Holocaust as a defining moment requiring continuous vigilance against repetition. Japan's confrontation with its past followed a different pattern. The immediate post-war period saw some acknowledgement. The Tokyo trials prosecuted leaders, and initial occupation policies included education about wartime actions. But as the Cold War intensified and American priorities shifted, pressure for historical accountability diminished. Japanese textbooks increasingly minimized wartime atrocities. The Nanjing massacre was described as an incident. Comfort women were rarely mentioned. Unit 731 disappeared from historical accounts. Politicians who visited Yasukuni Shrine, which honors war dead including convicted war criminals, faced little domestic opposition but generated diplomatic crises with China and Korea. Japanese official apologies, when issued, were often vague and followed by actions that undermined them. Prime ministers would apologize for suffering caused to Asian nations, then visits to Yasukuni would suggest the apologies weren't sincere. Comfort women survivors seeking acknowledgement and compensation faced decades of official denial that they were coerced, with Japanese government positions ranging from claiming they were willing prostitutes to denying the system existed. This pattern created a cycle where victims' advocates kept raising issues, Japanese conservatives reacted defensively, and international awareness remained focused on the lack of acknowledgement rather than the original crimes. Germany's relative forthrightness made its crimes easier to discuss historically because they were acknowledged. Japan's defensiveness made discussing its crimes feel like contemporary political disputes rather than settled history.
How each nation confronted its past profoundly affected global memory. Germany's reckoning with the Holocaust, though slow and incomplete, far exceeded Japan's acknowledgement of wartime atrocities. West Germany began seriously confronting the Holocaust in the 1960s. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, 1963 to 1965, prosecuted camp guards and administrators, forcing public discussion of German responsibility. The 1968 student movement demanded that the older generation acknowledge their complicity. By the 1970s and 1980s, Holocaust education became mandatory in German schools. Willy Brandt's 1970 genuflection at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial symbolized official acknowledgement of German guilt. Successive German governments issued apologies, paid reparations to survivors in Israel, and constructed memorials. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, opened in 2005, occupies prime real estate near the Brandenburg Gate, a physical manifestation of Germany's willingness to confront its past. This confrontation wasn't complete or universal. Many Germans resisted acknowledging responsibility, but the overall trajectory was toward greater acknowledgement, education, and memorialization. German law prohibits Holocaust denial. Schools teach the Nazi period extensively. Public discourse treats the Holocaust as a defining moment requiring continuous vigilance against repetition. Japan's confrontation with its past followed a different pattern. The immediate post-war period saw some acknowledgement. The Tokyo trials prosecuted leaders, and initial occupation policies included education about wartime actions. But as the Cold War intensified and American priorities shifted, pressure for historical accountability diminished. Japanese textbooks increasingly minimized wartime atrocities. The Nanjing massacre was described as an incident. Comfort women were rarely mentioned. Unit 731 disappeared from historical accounts. Politicians who visited Yasukuni Shrine, which honors war dead, including convicted war criminals, faced little domestic opposition but generated diplomatic crises with China and Korea. Japanese official apologies, when issued, were often vague and followed by actions that undermined them. Prime ministers would apologize for suffering caused to Asian nations, then visits to Yasukuni would suggest the apologies weren't sincere.
Comfort women survivors seeking acknowledgement and compensation faced decades of official denial that they were coerced, with Japanese government positions ranging from claiming they were willing prostitutes to denying the system existed. This pattern created a cycle where victims' advocates kept raising issues, Japanese conservatives reacted defensively, and international awareness remained focused on the lack of acknowledgement rather than the original crimes. Germany's relative forthrightness made its crimes easier to discuss historically because they were acknowledged. Japan's defensiveness made discussing its crimes feel like contemporary political disputes rather than settled history.
The uncomfortable truth is that racial perceptions shaped how Western nations remembered and memorialized victims. European Jews were white or white-adjacent in American racial categories. Their suffering resonated with white American and European audiences in ways that Asian suffering didn't. Holocaust survivors who emigrated to America could assimilate into whiteness. Their children and grandchildren became doctors, lawyers, academics, and business leaders without facing the racial barriers that Asian Americans encountered. This integration meant Holocaust memory became part of mainstream American consciousness rather than remaining confined to ethnic enclaves. Asian victims of Japanese atrocities faced different treatment. Chinese, Koreans, and Filipinos in America occupied marginalized positions in the racial hierarchy. Their communities were smaller, less politically powerful, and their stories received less attention from mainstream media and institutions. This racial dynamic was explicit during the war itself. American propaganda depicted Japanese as subhuman in ways that German propaganda was not. German political cartoons showed Japanese with exaggerated racial features, buck teeth, slanted eyes, simian characteristics. Germans were depicted as misguided or evil, but still human. Japanese were depicted as vermin to be exterminated. This racialized perception persisted into peacetime. German Americans faced minimal discrimination after the war. German cultural festivals continued, German language instruction resumed, and German heritage was celebrated. Japanese Americans, despite fighting valiantly in segregated units while their families were interned, faced continued suspicion and discrimination. The victims of Japanese atrocities, being Asian, received less sympathy from Western audiences than European victims of Nazi atrocities. This racism was rarely explicit after the war. It manifested as indifference, as lesser media coverage, as fewer educational programs, as fewer memorial sites receiving less funding and fewer visitors. Popular culture, particularly Hollywood films, profoundly shaped how generations learned about World War II. The films made about European theater far outnumbered Pacific theater films, and the way they portrayed enemies differed significantly. Films about the European theater, The Great Escape, The Longest Day, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, presented German enemies as complex characters. Wehrmacht soldiers could be portrayed as honorable professionals following orders. Individual Germans could be heroes. Oskar Schindler saving Jews, Klaus von Stauffenberg attempting to assassinate Hitler. The narrative allowed for good Germans and focused villainy on specifically Nazi ideology and leadership. Pacific theater films, Pathan, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Tora Tora Tora, more often depicted Japanese as undifferentiated enemy masses. Individual Japanese characters were rare. The focus was on American soldiers' experience rather than the enemy's humanity. Even sympathetic portrayals like Letters from Iwo Jima came decades after the standard narrative was established. Holocaust films became a distinct genre. Schindler's List won Best Picture and became required viewing in many schools. The Pianist, Life is Beautiful, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, these films kept Holocaust memory prominent in popular culture. They were commercially successful,
critically acclaimed, and educationally valuable. Films about Japanese atrocities are far fewer and reached smaller audiences. The Railway Man, 2013, addressed POW treatment. City of Life and Death, 2009, a Chinese film about the Nanjing massacre, received limited Western distribution. Unbroken, 2014, touched on POW abuse but focused on the American survivor's story rather than systematically documenting Japanese war crimes. This imbalance meant that, for most Americans and Europeans, World War II memory came from films that centered European theater and German villainy, while minimizing or ignoring Asian theater and Japanese atrocities. Educational curricula reinforced these patterns. American and European schools taught the Holocaust extensively, while giving minimal attention to Japanese atrocities. The Holocaust education became mandatory in many states and countries. Dedicated curricula, teacher training, survivor speaker programs, and field trips to Holocaust museums ensured students learned detailed histories of Nazi crimes. The Holocaust became a case study for teaching about genocide, human rights, and moral responsibility. Japanese atrocities received cursory mentions, if any. Standard American textbooks might dedicate chapters to the Holocaust while summarizing the entire Pacific War in pages. Nanjing might be mentioned in a sentence. Comfort women might not appear at all. Unit 731 was almost never discussed. This educational imbalance created generational knowledge gaps. Students graduated knowing about Auschwitz, but not Unit 731. About Kristallnacht, but not the Nanjing massacre. About Anne Frank, but not Iris Chang. The textbook disparities weren't accidental. They reflected what educators thought was important and what communities pressured schools to teach. Jewish communities organized Holocaust education programs and advocated for curriculum mandates. Asian American communities, smaller and less politically organized, had less success advocating for education about Japanese atrocities. Additionally, teaching Japanese atrocities was complicated by Cold War politics. Highlighting Japanese crimes meant acknowledging Chinese suffering, but Cold War narratives emphasized Communist China as an enemy. Teaching about Japanese biological warfare meant acknowledging American decisions to grant immunity to Unit 731 researchers, a politically uncomfortable topic.
The prominence of survivor testimony shaped memory profoundly. Holocaust survivors wrote memoirs, gave speeches, appeared in documentaries, and became public figures advocating for remembrance. Organizations collected survivor testimonies systematically. The Fortunoff Video Archive at Yale, the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, and Yad Vashem's testimony collections preserved thousands of first-person accounts. Elie Wiesel became a global figure, winning the Nobel Peace Prize and advising presidents. His memoir, Night, became a required reading. Other survivors, Primo Levi, Viktor Frankl, Simon Wiesenthal, published widely read accounts that kept Holocaust memory alive. Survivors of Japanese atrocities had fewer platforms. Language barriers made their testimonies less accessible to Western audiences. Chinese survivors of Nanjing wrote accounts in Chinese, reaching Chinese audiences, but rarely translated and distributed in the West. Korean comfort women survivors faced social stigma that kept many silent for decades. When they finally began speaking publicly in the 1990s, they were elderly, and their testimonies came late to Western attention. The organizational infrastructure that supported Holocaust survivor testimony had no equivalent for Japanese atrocity survivors. No major university created archives for Nanjing survivors. No foundation collected systematic video testimonies from comfort women. The imbalance in institutional support meant fewer survivor stories reached global audiences.
Perceived justice, or its absence, affected how crimes were remembered. Nazi war criminals faced prosecution that, while incomplete, was visible and internationally significant. The Nuremberg trials were extensively documented, broadcast, and presented as landmark legal proceedings establishing principles of international justice. Adolf Eichmann's 1961 capture and trial in Israel renewed attention to Nazi crimes and established legal precedents. Subsequent decades saw continued prosecution of Nazi war criminals, even those discovered in old age. The message was clear: Nazi crimes would be pursued and punished indefinitely. Japanese war criminals faced less consistent justice. The Tokyo trials prosecuted major leaders, but the proceedings received less international attention than Nuremberg. Many officials responsible for atrocities were never charged. Unit 731 personnel received immunity. The emperor, whose approval enabled the war, was explicitly protected. Post-war, prosecution of Japanese war criminals effectively ceased while Nazi prosecution continued. This disparity suggested that German crimes were taken more seriously by international justice systems, reinforcing perceptions that they were more important historically. Comfort women who sought compensation in Japanese courts faced decades of dismissals and minimal settlements. Forced laborers seeking acknowledgement from Japanese corporations encountered similar obstacles. The lack of justice for victims meant their stories remained contentious rather than historically settled. A memory industry developed around the Holocaust. Museums, memorials, education centers, and academic programs that had no equivalent for Japanese atrocities. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., funded by Congress, receives millions of visitors annually. Major cities worldwide have Holocaust museums and education centers. Memorials to Nazi victims dot Europe. Stolperstein, brass plaques embedded in sidewalks, marking where Holocaust victims lived, number over 75,000 across European cities. Anne Frank's house in Amsterdam is a major tourist destination. Auschwitz-Birkenau receives over 2 million visitors annually. This infrastructure creates continuous engagement with Holocaust memory. School groups tour museums, families visit memorials, tourists encounter reminders throughout Europe. The physical presence keeps the history prominent. Memorials to Japanese atrocity victims exist, but are far fewer and receive less international attention. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall in China is extensive, but visited primarily by Chinese citizens. The Sadaemin prison in Seoul preserves evidence of Japanese colonial oppression, but is rarely visited by non-Koreans. No equivalent to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum exists in Washington for Japanese war crimes, despite America's direct involvement in the Pacific War. This institutional disparity means that German crimes remain continuously visible in public space, while Japanese crimes recede into specialized academic knowledge. Asian victims and advocates faced a double bind. Raising awareness of Japanese atrocities risked being dismissed as politically motivated or nationalist, while remaining silent meant continued obscurity. When Chinese officials highlighted Japanese war crimes, Western observers often interpreted this as Chinese government propaganda rather than legitimate historical memory. Korean advocacy for comfort women recognition was dismissed as nationalist resentment. Philippine survivors seeking acknowledgement were barely heard. This skepticism rarely applied to Holocaust survivors, whose testimonies were generally received as legitimate historical witness. The different treatment reflected deeper assumptions about whose testimony deserved credibility and which victims warranted attention. Asian advocates also faced accusations of perpetuating conflict by not moving on. German officials who downplayed the Holocaust faced intense criticism, but Japanese officials who minimized atrocities could claim that continued advocacy was preventing reconciliation. This dynamic blamed victims for the absence of closure, rather than perpetrators for the absence of acknowledgement.
Why did Germany become the main villain of World War II in Western memory, while Japan faded? The answer is complex, troubling, and reveals uncomfortable truths about how history is remembered. Cold War politics prioritized alliances over justice, but applied different standards to Germany and Japan. Geography placed German crimes closer to Western consciousness. The nature of Nazi bureaucratic genocide provided compelling narrative and physical evidence. Liberation stories centered Western heroes. German confrontation with the past, though imperfect, exceeded Japan's defensiveness. Racism made European victims more sympathetic to Western audiences than Asian victims. Hollywood amplified these patterns. Educational systems reinforced them. Holocaust survivors had platforms that Japanese atrocity survivors lacked. Prosecution of Nazi criminals continued while Japanese prosecution ceased. A memory industry developed around the Holocaust without equivalent for Japanese crimes. And Asian victims faced skepticism that European victims didn't. None of this diminishes Nazi crimes or suggests the Holocaust receives too much attention. The Holocaust was an unparalleled horror that deserves continuous study, remembrance, and education. The issue is not that German crimes are over-remembered, but that Japanese crimes are under-remembered. The inequality of memory matters because history shapes present understanding. When atrocities are forgotten, lessons go unlearned. When victims are ignored, justice remains incomplete. When one set of crimes becomes synonymous with absolute evil while equivalent crimes fade into obscurity, we fail to understand the full scope of human capacity for horror. The question is not whether to remember the Holocaust less, but whether to remember Nanjing, Unit 731, comfort women, and millions of Asian victims more. The challenge is expanding historical consciousness to include all victims of World War II atrocities, regardless of their race, nationality, or geographic distance from Western centers of cultural production. Germany became the main villain of World War II in Western memory through a complex interaction of politics, geography, race, narrative, and institutional power. Japan faded not because its crimes were lesser, but because global memory systems valued some victims over others. Recognizing this inequality is the first step toward correcting it. The victims of Japanese atrocities deserve the same remembrance, education, and memorialization as victims of Nazi atrocities. Their stories are equally important, their sufferings equally real, their memory equally worthy of preservation. History is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it. The inequality in how World War II villainy is remembered reveals not just past events, but present priorities and values. Addressing this inequality requires conscious effort to amplify forgotten voices, challenge comfortable narratives, and recognize that all victims of wartime atrocities deserve acknowledgement, regardless of their race or how well their stories fit Western narratives.